All right, welcome to Head of the Class, a podcast produced by Our Schools USA. I'm Christina Gagne, the former school board member, in case this is the first time you are seeing us on video doing the podcast.
And I'm Christy Hurst, the former teacher and current parent of 3 kids in public schools.
So this is a new adventure for us, so bear with us. This is the first time we've done our podcast on video, but we've had a lot of requests that we do this on video just so people are able to watch it as well as listen to it. And so this season, the entire podcast will be available both via audio as well as video. So you can still download it from all of your favorite streaming platforms. You can go directly to our website. Or if you want to hang out with us for the 25 to 30 minutes on video that this podcast will be, we're happy to have you. So if you've listened to the podcast, you know that we have been digging into for the last year what is happening in our public schools and how it's being caused by far-right extremists. And I think that there's been some sort of obvious things that you see front and center in your local communities. You go to school board meetings, and over the last couple of years, they've just become these insane affairs where grifters and people are coming from across the state or across the country to sort of invade school board meetings and cause chaos. And then we talked about some of the not so obvious players in the public education space that are trying to undermine public education. So today's podcast actually was inspired by a 3-minute video that I did about a week and a half ago. It was on a Washington Post article, and we will post a link to this as well with the podcast. But the article is actually from December 6th, and the title of it is, How Did This Charter School Get a Nearly $2 million federal grant? And I pointed this out in the video. This really is not about charter schools necessarily. It is about a far-right extremist charter school basically misrepresenting itself through this federal grant process and getting federal grant funding. And the reason that we are highlighting this on this podcast is that we are really trying to explore the theme of they say one thing on the far right, and then they go and they do another. They also are trying to undermine civil rights in our public schools and more broadly. And so I think this brings together all of those themes in this article. So we're going to kind of take this piece by piece. But Christy, you've had a chance to also look at it post my video a week and a half ago. So sort of what are your initial themes that you think our listeners and our viewers should pay attention to?
I think that one thing that's notable is this same type of charter, and in fact, I believe there are charters tied to this company. They're popping up in other parts of the country as well and being propped up as public charter schools. And I think that, one thing we want people to be aware of is that maybe pay a little more bit of attention to when these charter schools get brought forth in your district or your county or your community, because sometimes they are not actually public schools. They are really undercover as religious schools, and they are using some of those practices that you see religious private schools use. And we'll talk about that in the article. You'll see things like discrimination, things like there's no separation of church and state, the kind of thing that shouldn't be, public dollars shouldn't be going towards.
Yeah, and the article points out that this program and the intent of this program, and just for everyone's reference, it's the U.S. Department of Education's Charter Schools program. The intent of the grant program is to help fuel charter schools who are addressing the needs of populations who desperately need it. So communities where rural communities are a great example, urban communities where there's socioeconomic disparities and other things that need to be addressed. And the idea is that the charter schools are getting money to either upstart in these communities and provide a valuable service, a valuable type of curriculum, or to, fill a hole, fill a need. Mm-hmm. So that's really the intent of the program, is to sort of meet parents and students and families where they're at in these communities. And again, this is not a podcast about charter schools. What's interesting, though, is, and what the article's really trying to get at, is that a school that applied for funding and got $2 million, so just sort of wrap your head around that in the public education space. Like, that's a pretty decent chunk of change for a program or a school to get through any federal program, nonetheless, this particular program. And the school that went after one of these grants, and again, the intent of the grant is to serve the need, like either a socioeconomic or racial need, like communities in need. That's really the point of these grants. But the school that got one of these grants, the $2 million grant, is Cincinnati Classical Academy. And we are trying to sort of flag buzzwords in the far right space as we go through our social media as well as this podcast. I'm not saying every school called a classical academy is a Hillsdale school, but we have noticed a trend of late that even in our own backyard, not too far away,
It
the
is.
classical academy is a Hillsdale school. It uses the Hillsdale curriculum. It uses 1776. It uses sort of all the things that you're seeing the far right media and the group that's actually trying to privatize public education, all the curriculum and things that they push out to their own followers as well as to their own schools. So CCA, Cincinnati Classical Academy, gets one of these $2 million grants. And so what the reporter has found out, and what several organizations have dug into this, and I'm sure there's going to be more research on this. What was found out through this article is that while in their grant application they represented they were going to be serving these very diverse populations, it turned out that only 16% of the students it serves, so literally like over 80% of the students in the school do not fall into this category. Only 16% of its students are economic disadvantaged, and that only 2% are Black. And why that's important is they put in this application and dressed it up as, we are going to serve Black students in the Cincinnati community. And just so you know, the student body in Cincinnati schools is majority Black students. So they went to the federal government, they asked for money, they said they were going to serve this population that has a huge need. The reality is they're not even serving the need. So just stopping there, this misrepresentation and misuse of federal dollars should make taxpayers mad that they're not actually serving the kids that they said they were going to serve. Beyond that, though, they are taking
like
this money to push Hillsdale curriculum.
Yes. Yeah. And you're talking like in Cincinnati public schools, more than 80% of students were economically disadvantaged. At this classical school, 17%. So we're not talking a little discrepancy here.
And that's a major issue, when it comes to this particular school. But just a couple of things that we want to point out is, first, you're going to hear this election cycle, and you've probably already heard this, that there are certain states' governors that are refusing to take federal funds. So you may have already heard a little bit of this, and it's been right now related to free and reduced lunch programs. And you're probably thinking at this point, Christina, need to stop talking about lunch, particularly free lunch. But the reason we bring it up is because it resonates. I think most sane, rational people would say feeding hungry kids is a good idea. And so you might be wondering why 15 governors plus, Republican governors, are coming out and saying that they don't want federal dollars for lunch. And you might say, why wouldn't they want to take federal funding? Wouldn't that be good for the state coffers to get federal money to fill in the blanks to help feed these kids? And I think a couple of years ago, there was not this big debate, not this big conversation about this. But the reason that they don't want to take the federal money, and the reason this is becoming a talking point, is because groups that are sort of at the top of the public policy food chain on the far right are creating this narrative that if you take federal dollars, you have to follow federal rules. Mm-hmm. And I don't just mean federal rules like guidelines, I mean federal law. And more importantly, you have to follow federal civil rights law. You cannot take federal dollars to administer programs and not follow federal civil rights laws as they relate to public schools. So the reason these governors are not taking the lunch money, which is sort of funny, but it's lunch money, they're not taking the lunch money, is because they are trying to somehow send this message that they don't want to take the money and have the strings attached of having to follow the federal civil rights laws. Now, I want to be clear. Public schools across the country at the state level, so whether it's the state superintendent of public instruction, whether it's the county level, the local level, take federal dollars. They survive based on taking these federal dollars. But the far right is trying to create this narrative that the civil rights laws that exist, the civil rights leaders that we all know and respect and admire, that they have it wrong. And that's why Christy has been covering, she had several videos about the attacks on Martin Luther King Jr., the attacks on civil rights. I mean, most recently, you're seeing attacks on female pilots. And you're probably like, why is that even remotely related to what we're talking about? Because they are trying to create this distrust of the civil rights movement and civil rights leaders so that there's a distrust of civil rights law.
There's the same way they were trying to create a distrust of public schools. The same thing. Now they're moving on to their next target, and that's civil rights laws and protections that are in place. And that's why when you look at, and we're going to keep talking about this all year, I know people are going to get tired of hearing it, but it's just so critical. You hear it over and over and understand it, that when you read Project 2025, there is a dismantling of civil rights all over the place. And in fact, I'm working with like a group of influencers looking at the entire Project 2025, and everyone is echoing that same sentiment, that in every chapter there is a chipping away at civil rights protections. So that is definitely something that we want to flag and keep reiterating, because I know, I believe it's essential for society to be functioning well. And, just somebody who values democracy, the civil rights protections have always been a big deal to me. And I think it's that way for most people. But that's why this attack has begun now, right? They have to start getting you to distrust and sort of desensitize people to hearing negative things about Martin Luther King. Because for those of us in the age range of Christina and I, we've only grown up hearing positive things about Martin Luther King. And so they need to start chipping away at that, because he is such a civil rights icon that he needs to be torn down also for them to chip away at civil rights. And all these things we're seeing, these charter schools stepping in even. This charter school that we're talking about today is ignoring civil rights protections that are in place and discriminating against certain students, which goes against civil rights.
Yeah, and the other thing that I want to mention is that these classical academy schools. So there's the front of what we're now seeing on social media. So if you've seen some things over the last couple of weeks and you're like, I don't see the relation to public schools, but man, that's offensive. Like Charlie Kirk going after Martin Luther King Jr. and you're like, where did that come from? Or like the female pilot thing. There's just all these things that have popped up over the last couple of weeks. And you're probably like, that came out of left field, out of nowhere. This is them planting the seed. This is them building towards that narrative. And you have to start with the media personalities, and then they have to keep hearing it again and again. But let's not forget that even though we wholeheartedly disagree with these people, there's a portion of the population on the far right that just trusts what they say. And so when you want to start a narrative and you want people to buy in, this is where it starts. And I want to further say that, I think that many of us got caught off guard 2-3 years ago, because we weren't on right-wing media and we didn't see the assault on public schools. And I mean, there's been an assault on public schools for a while, but this new far right invasive monster liberty flavor of it, like, we did not see it because we weren't on far right media. But if you go back, and clearly many people are probably like, you know what? I don't want to revisit the last couple of years given what happened. But if you were to go back and actually look at the media, you can see where this started to get planted immediately when the pandemic hit. Immediately, you can see where the seed started to get planted, and that scaffolding and that ladder of building to what the ultimate goal is, which was to create chaos in school board meetings and then get people off boards and then go into school districts and implement policies. So you can go back and see that happening. This is the beginning of that. But what is scary for me is those civil rights protections, the federal Department of Education, which is also why they want to destroy it, they want to get rid of it. That's the check in communities where they are not abiding by civil rights and not protecting students and families. So if you're in a school district and they are violating your civil rights, and I'll give a great example. Maybe there are female athletes like in your public schools, and for some reason they're facing discrimination or sexual harassment, and the school district doesn't do anything. They can go to the federal office for civil rights within the Department of Education and file a complaint. And you can't do that in all states because not all states have a Department of Education, a state level Department of Education or corollary that will be responsive. Because let's remember, we don't live in the United States where you have the same rights in every single state. Because if some states, Oklahoma is a great example. Good gosh, what is happening in Oklahoma with public education with Ryan Walters and the people he's bringing on? That's not a state where you're probably going to find the result you need to get justice for what happened. So they're chipping away at the federal Department of Education and wanting to get rid of it so there's not those checks and balances, and they're trying to erode civil rights. And it's not just rights they initially tried to brand it as just rights for LGBTQIA staff and students and families, but that's not all they're chipping away at. If you start to read through the lines and actually read Project 2025, which we're not making this up. It's a literal black and white document. You can go in and read it. They literally go in and bold the worst parts of it. That was sort of what blew me away. Not even like hidden in like these large paragraphs. Like they do call outs in the document and bold all the bad stuff. So they're not hiding it. Like this is what they're going to do. And so we're just trying to connect the dots of like why the first month of the year, these crazy things are happening. But on the ground where you're seeing this is something like this classical academy. And they're going to try to hide the connections between these types of classical academy schools and these larger organizations. But in a minute, we'll talk about how obvious some of the connections are.
And I think that that's the takeaway too, as we talk about this school, to keep in mind that Project 2025 wants schools like this everywhere. This is what they want all schools to look like across the country. So that's another piece of information and why we wanted to highlight this school and what's happening there. This is like their ideal school nationally in Project 2025, to give you like a little summary as best we can.
Yes. And I did my favorite activity, which is when I start reading articles, I start to Google things. And I, want to thank this, author who put this piece together of linking to the website. But, they are a Hillsdale college school. And they try to obfuscate, or they used to try to obfuscate, I should say, that they were affiliated with Hillsdale College. But I literally am on the website right now. I went on right before the podcast. I couldn't even get into the website. And there's a pop-up. And it says, Classical Renaissance Gala, we invite you to our inaugural charity event featuring speaker Dr. Larry Arnn, president of Hillsdale College. So on March 16th, if you're in Cincinnati, and this is something you're interested in, which I don't think if you're on this podcast, you're interested in that. But, that's so blatant.
Right.
Even though that's not what they represented, like their curriculum to be, who they were serving. But that's what Hillsdale is trying to do, is they are trying to pull money away from public schools, pull money away from traditional public charter schools, and put them into their private schools. And that's essentially what the Cincinnati Classical Academy is. It's a private school. And the reason they also don't want civil rights protections around the federal dollars is because if there's not those civil rights protections, if there's not those checks and balances, they don't have to let any disadvantaged students in. And when I say disadvantaged students, I mean whatever they decide is disadvantaged. Private schools don't have to let people in. Mm-hmm. They could just say, I don't like the family, you're not in. You have special education needs, you're not in. You're a certain race, you're a certain religion, you're not in. So it's not just focused on one dynamic. Like they have the ultimate decision of who enters their schools. It is not an open forum like public schools where everyone is welcome and support is provided, or even public charter schools. So that's the difference, is that they want that ability to discriminate in a variety of ways. And that's what's scary, is that our federal taxpayer dollars that we go to work for and invest in our public programs and public education is now being used not just for private schools, but the curriculum they teach also. And I think this is important. And we will get more into this curriculum. We've had a little bit of conversation on Hillsdale, a little more about American birthright standards. Yikes. But it's very similar. It's this fake pro-America version, which is not pro-America, because one of the things that's been so great about America is how diverse it is. But it's this, purportedly pro-America curriculum that actually is not very accurate about what happened in American history. And so they want to use these schools to further a point of view, which probably makes historians shudder.
For sure.
So, this little article, I think, just had, a lot of little pieces in it. But I also want to, and again, now that you can see us, we're not wearing tinfoil hats. So now we're not wearing tinfoil hats. And I don't see behind Christy a mind map, like with the pins and the threads, and not in my house either. But, the connections between all of this are also important. This school is supported through the Barney Charter School Initiative. And you can look that up, but the Barney Family Foundation funds that. And who are they also tied to and related to? It's a far right greatest hits. It's Americans for Prosperity, the Cato Institute, the Hoover Institution, the Heartland Institute, the State Policy Network, the Friedman Foundation for Educational Choice, and then last but certainly not least, and I know everyone's going to get tired by the end of 2024 of us saying the name of this organization, the Heritage Foundation. But that's the cast of characters who's involved with the school and has connections to who funds the school. So when we talk about these interrelationships, this is not us just positing that, like, yeah, behind the scenes something is happening. This is in public tax documents that are linked to in this article that you can pull and see the funding relationships.
That's what
And those dollars talk, and those dollars are there to push a message. And the reason that you fund these classical academies is you want students and families hearing your message. The same reason that the far right has created these media outlets that are basically nonprofit organizations, not actually like, traditional media that is non-biased to the extent that it can be and is. They have these new media outlets and networks that are also funded by these groups. So at all turns, in K through 12 education, at home watching news media, on the internet, you're just hearing this message if you're on the far right, or you might lean that way or be in a household with that again and again and again, but through different sources. And so we're just trying to show how those sources impact our public schools and public school funding.
And I think too that we're going to keep coming back to this, that, Hillsdale is connected and Heritage is funding this, and Heritage's plan is to destroy public education. So if Heritage is backing your charter school, it's probably not a good sign that it's going to serve the needs of the greater good and the entire community, because the goals that Heritage has plainly put out for us are telling us what they want, and they want public education destroyed.
Well, they also, and this is something we highlighted, I believe, in our last Project 2025 podcast, and we're going to be revisiting Project 2025. We had a series of 5 podcasts where we endeavored in our best attempt to break down this 46 page chapter that was very dense. But our last podcast covered the fact that, yes, they want privatization. That's clear. I mean, you can look at states across the country that are led by far right extremists, and state by state, there's voucher programs. And those voucher programs, we'll get way more into this, but oh my gosh, what state bloated programs that are simply not working for families. Like, these programs are not run well, and they're just examples of badly run state programs that are getting way too much taxpayer funding and just not serving the ends that they said they were going to serve to taxpayers, which, a lot of people, we know this is the economy, everyone's worried about that. We're worried about that. Like, this is not something to take lightly, like the investment that our families make in taxpayer dollars to a lot of programs. And so it just pains me to see that these promises get put out to families, and then these states are not actually coming through on those promises, even though they're using hard-earned taxpayer dollars to do this. But one of the funny things is that they're not actually going to end up funding years and years and years from now, 10 years from now, if Project 2025 goes into effect, if Donald Trump, for example, is the nominee, and we cannot predict what will happen in the 2024 election. I'm going to knock on. Christy's going to do it too. But, we can't make a prediction at this point. Their ultimate goal is not to give any taxpayer funding to education, that families on their own should be responsible for it. Well, I'm sorry, how impossible is that for working families and families across this country to just have their own education? Like, that's the most insane idea, and so antithetical to why public education was even started in this country in the first place. And the other thing that I've been seeing, and I'm just going to throw this in there, and this is one of those, I throw a bomb over the wall, and it's like, okay, we're going to talk about it more. You might have also
say on this, so I feel like, are we going to go into this now? Because I have a lot to say.
Yeah, we're going to definitely get into it. But the one point I want to say is, and we're kind of pointing out some weird things that have come up the last few months. So like the Martin Luther King is not cool anymore thing. I saw that and was like, where? That's left field. Now we're understanding where it's coming from. The other thing that's been weird is you'll notice that states, Florida's one of them, are putting out these bills saying that students, people under the age of 18, should be able to work longer hours, like 40-day work weeks. And that started to strike me as funny about 5 or 6 months ago. Like, why are we retracting protections for children at work? But if you kind of think about it, if you're not going to fund public education, you're not going to fund private education. This is one of those things where I'm like, where are they going with this? It's really weird. But I feel like that is also tied to this as well. So you might have seen and heard about some bills that are trying to retract protections for kids working. That's also is kind of a similar flavor.
Recently, that was just talking about how horrible working conditions have been for children in some states now that are breaking laws that even exist already. So, I mean, this is I did not see this coming, but we're going to like roll back protections of kids to be working and to be safe if they work. I mean, I did not have that on my.
Well, I find great irony that the Protect All Kids crowd votes these people in office who then do things that really could put children's health and welfare in jeopardy. So the irony is not lost on us when these things happen, and they keep happening repeatedly. But the last thing I want to bring up as we wrap this up, this article, because it does just bring up a lot of good themes. And so this is why we wanted to have a podcast on it today, is that you will see these groups repeatedly say, we don't take federal money. We won't take federal money. Just like the governors will say it in different states, certain organizations will say it, some of these schools will say it. Hillsdale College boasts repeatedly that they don't take federal money, that their schools don't take federal money. But here it is, plain as day, Hillsdale College taking $2 million from one of its schools. So, they're telling you, the taxpayer, the parent, the community member, that like, that's bad. They shouldn't do that. We shouldn't be taking any of that funding. In fact, we don't. But they're lying to your face. They are telling you one thing and doing another. And that's a repeated theme of the far right sort of leadership mouthpieces, organizations, is that they are telling their followers one thing and getting them to believe a narrative and a story as if it's fact. But the reality is something completely different is happening behind the scenes. I just think this is a good example of that.
For sure. And you're going to see that over and over and over pertaining to education. So everywhere, but we'll focus on that piece.
Yeah. So we just wanted to point this out. We got a lot of questions about the video that I did. So we want to take a little time just to tease out why we covered it, what the themes are. We sort of jumped into a lot of different things today, but we will be covering all those things, over the next couple of weeks, just to kind of let you know where we're going with our podcast. Since now we're on camera, I thought this was going to be very awkward, but it's been fine so far.
We're getting
okay. We have a lot of great interviews. We are really excited. I'm personally excited. We have a lot of great interviews coming up. There's some amazing people across this country working in and around public education and public education advocacy. Also people that they are brand new to this, but they've done just this amazing work over the last year. And so we're really pumped to have them on the podcast. We have authors that have been, in the trenches researching this and doing work that have come on the podcast. We have partners of ours who, we're all ramped up and ready to go for 2024, what they're going to be doing. So we have a lot of ground to cover. And, it's only been, I looked at the calendar this morning. It's only February, like not even February yet. So I was just like,
February.
Yeah, it's going to be wild. I think that the next, month and a half with all the primaries that are happening, I think there's going to be some twists and turns that we need to cover and we will cover. But, we're really excited to do this over video. We've had a request throughout the last 6 months to do it. If you know our journey, and the reason I always keep saying this stuff is we get a lot of parents and community members who are like, I can't make a video on social media, or I'm going to go on Instagram. Who's going to follow me? I'm a big public speaker. I'm not shy. I was on a school board. I have no problem speaking in front of thousands of people in person. Doing this on the internet, though, Christy could tell you, I was not. I wasn't sold.
It's a weird process to get used to. It is. I mean, I tell people all the time, I did not even have a public-facing social media account before you and I started doing this. Had nothing public you could see.
Yeah. So, and, I actually, as an elected official, just so you know, like to be transparent, when you have your own social media and you use it for any public purpose, you can't remove stuff in most jurisdictions. So there are, in our state, California, the Brown Act would prohibit me from removing a really nasty comment, but I'm not allowed to do that. So
as an elected official.
Yeah. Yes. So I lived for years with oh, here's a dog I saw. Isn't he cute? And boom, just wow. I mean, but I couldn't do anything about it. But you can do something about it. And we've learned that. So, you don't have to deal with the haters, but people actually want to hear from you. So we do want to encourage people that are thinking, what can I do for my local public schools? Maybe you're really busy, you're commuting, you don't think you have time, but I'm telling you, 2 to 3 minute videos educating your community about what's happening. People are watching and paying attention. And we've actually had several of our chapters reach out to us, as well as, moms that we've inspired over the last year. And they were like, I didn't think anyone would listen. And now, I have 200 people following me. And that's great because they live in a small community. That's a lot of people for a small
Yeah.
community. So we just want to encourage you. And the reason we finally decided to go on video is, I'm sort of if you're going to talk the talk, you better walk the walk. So
100%.
here we are attempting to walk the walk, but hopefully we did okay. But thanks for joining us for episode number 2, and we look forward to further conversations.